Story 1.
I never imagined that a simple package could completely change my life. My name is Sarah Thompson. I'm 34 years old and I'm a single mother of a 7-year-old girl called Emma. I live alone on a small farm outside of Abilene, Texas, a place that has always been peaceful and predictable. I work as a substitute teacher at the local school and live a very simple life, looking after my daughter and our small property. That September morning, everything seemed completely normal when the mail truck drove by and left a strange package on the front porch, right next to my old wooden swing set. The package had no identified sender, just a yellowed envelope with my name written by hand, in shaky old handwriting. When I opened it, I found an old toy, a porcelain doll with faded blue eyes and a lacy dress that looked decades old. Emma didn't show much interest when I showed her. She just shrugged her shoulders and continued watching cartoons on TV. Something about that doll made me uneasy, not because of its scary appearance, but because of a strange sensation that ran down my spine. I placed the doll on a high shelf in my room, out of Emma's reach, trying to ignore that inexplicable feeling of being watched. That night, the first signs that something was wrong began to appear subtly. Around 11 p.m., as I was preparing breakfast for the next day, the kitchen lights began to flicker strangely, creating an irregular rhythm that made my skin crawl. At first I thought it was a wiring problem, something common in older homes like mine, but the pattern was very specific: 3 quick blinks, a pause, then 2 slow blinks. My cell phone was on the counter and I didn't even consider calling an electrician at that moment. Something told me to stay quiet and just observe. When I returned to the room, I noticed that the doll was no longer on the shelf where I had left it. I searched the entire room, my heart beating faster and faster, until I found her sitting on my nightstand, in the exact same place where I always left Emma's baby photo. His blue eyes looked different now, no longer faded, but with a strange glow that made me freeze for a few seconds. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that Emma had probably moved the doll, but Emma was fast asleep in the next room, and I knew my daughter would never come into my room without telling me. In the early hours of the morning, a strange noise woke me up with a start. There were soft scratching sounds on the walls, as if something small was trying to move up or down, but he couldn't pinpoint its exact source. My first impulse was to check on Emma, who was still sleeping peacefully in her room. The clock showed exactly 3:17 in the morning, a time that always made me more apprehensive. I don't know why, but I always found this moment in the morning particularly heavy and silent. I went back to my room and noticed that the doll was now at the foot of my bed, in a slightly different position than it was before, as if it had moved a few centimeters on its own. So I decided to get rid of that object once and for all. The next morning, I took the doll and placed it inside a black garbage bag, closing it tightly. I took the bag outside, far from the house, and left it near the metal trash can at the end of our dirt path. I was sure I had definitely gotten rid of that strange object. I worked all day at school, trying not to think about what happened, but something inside me knew it wouldn't be that simple. When I returned home that afternoon, I had barely rested my bag before Emma came running over to show me something. The same doll, intact, sitting on the nightstand again. My daughter didn't seem to notice anything was wrong, but I was completely upset. I tried to remain calm and not show my desperation so as not to scare Emma. That night, I decided to do something more radical. I took the doll and placed it in the glove compartment of my Ford truck, then locked the vehicle. It was a cold September night in Texas. The sky was pitch black and the farm seemed quieter than ever. There was something in the air that made me constantly alert, as if something invisible was watching me. I remember I had a glass of wine to try to relax, but my nerves were completely frayed. When I woke up the next morning, I made Emma breakfast like I always did. I was distracted, thinking about the strange events, when my daughter interrupted me asking where the pretty lady was. Chilly, I asked what she was saying. Emma pointed to the nightstand and smiled, saying that she had talked to the doll during the night. I asked what they had talked about and she simply shrugged, quickly changing the subject to breakfast. Something inside me began to tremble, a fear that went beyond rational understanding. How could I explain that the doll was locked in the car and yet it seemed to be back home? That night, I decided to stay awake. I prepared a strong cup of coffee and sat in the living room, observing every corner of the house with an almost obsessive vigilance. The hours passed slowly, and the silence was broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Around 2 in the morning, I started to hear a very soft, almost imperceptible sound, as if something was lightly scratching the wood of the floor. My muscles instantly locked up, and my heart started beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. Emma was sleeping in the next room, and I didn't want to make any moves that might wake her up and scare her. The sound continued, now a little closer. It seemed to come from the hallway, moving toward me inch by inch. I tried to rationalize it, think it could just be a mouse or some other animal, but something in my instinct screamed that it wasn't natural at all. My eyes were fixed on the darkness of the hallway, trying to make out any movement. That's when I saw, for the briefest of moments, a shadow on the ground. It wasn't a shadow like the ones we normally see, cast by furniture or objects. It was something different, something that seemed to move on its own with no apparent origin. My entire body was covered in cold sweat, and I could barely breathe. The next morning, I decided to look for information about the doll's origins. I called my grandmother, who has always been known for her stories and knowledge about antiques in our family. She was strangely quiet when I described the doll, and after a long silence, she just said, "Sarah, get rid of that object as quickly as possible." His reaction scared me more than anything I had experienced up to that point. I returned home completely nervous, feeling like I was being watched the whole time, as if something invisible was always around me, breathing down the back of my neck. That night, Emma started talking in her sleep. I woke up with a start to his voice whispering words I couldn't quite understand. I approached her room slowly, afraid of what I might find. Emma's eyes were closed, but her mouth was moving quickly, as if she were talking to someone only she could see. As I got closer, I could hear a few snippets. Something about the lady who wants to play and don't tell mom. My entire body began to shake, and an inexplicable fear took over me. I decided to take the situation more seriously and started investigating. I spent hours researching the doll online, trying to understand its origins or anything that could give me a clue. I visited old forums, vintage toy collectors' websites, and even communities that discussed paranormal objects. Nothing. It was as if that doll didn't exist anywhere, as if it had simply appeared out of nowhere. My despair grew every day, and I could barely sleep. The nights became a constant nightmare, with strange sounds echoing through the house and that persistent feeling of being watched. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to do something radical. I picked up the doll and took it to the back of the farm, far from the house. I dug a deep hole really deep and buried her. I covered everything with dirt, stones, branches. I did everything so that no one would ever find it. I returned home exhausted, hoping that everything would finally be over. Emma was watching television, completely oblivious to what I had done. I took a hot shower, trying to calm down and convince myself that I had gotten rid of that nightmare once and for all. That night, everything seemed different. The silence was heavier, denser. I tried to sleep, but my eyes couldn't close completely. Around midnight, I heard something that chilled me to the core. The same scratching sound, now coming from inside my own room. I got up slowly, trying not to make any noise, and realized that the sound was coming from the nightstand. My breath hitched when I opened the drawer and saw, impossible but true, chunks of dirt and roots mixed in with the underwear, as if someone had dug back into the house. The doll was there again. I don't know how, I don't know why. His blue eyes seemed different now, with a shine that went beyond the glass, something that stared at me with an intensity that made me take a few steps back. I remembered what Emma had said about the lady who wants to play, and a shiver ran down my spine. At that moment, I understood that it didn't matter what I did. That doll was there to stay, and no one, including me, could change that. It was as if she had chosen our home, our family, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I never spoke about it to anyone again, not even my own family. Emma doesn't seem to remember anything, and the doll remains on the bedside table, as if it were part of the decoration. Sometimes, when I'm alone at home, I feel like she's watching me, waiting for something I don't know what it is. I try to rationalize, but something inside me knows there is something deeper, something I can't explain or understand. Time passed, but that feeling of being watched never completely left me. Today, years later, I still don't know what really happened in those days. The doll remains in the same place, intact, as if time had not passed for it. Emma grew up and never mentioned that lady who wanted to play again. Sometimes, when I look back, I question whether it was all real or just a figment of my imagination. But deep down I know something happened, something I can't explain, something that completely changed my life on that farm near Abilene. Story 2. I had never felt so scared before. I've always lived on farms, so it wasn't like I wasn't used to the challenges of the countryside. But this was different. It was a normal morning, or at least I thought it was. I woke up to roosters crowing, the sun starting to rise, and everything seemed normal. But as soon as I went downstairs, something was wrong. My father was standing in the kitchen, looking older than ever, with a strange expression on his face. He looked out the window at the fields, as if expecting to see something. I asked what was going on, and he just shook his head, as if he didn't want to say. I went out into the kitchen and looked around, trying to see what could be worrying my father so much. That's when I realized one of the sheep was missing. I was in shock for a second. What do you mean a sheep was missing? The enclosure was intact, as it always had been. There was no hole, no evidence that anything could have gotten in or out. My father finally spoke, quietly, as if he were talking to himself. She's just not here. My heart started to race. It didn't make sense. I was about to ask if he was sure one of the sheep was really missing when I heard my brother outside. He was screaming for our mother, calling her desperately. We went out to see what was going on and found my brother at the farthest part of the fence, near the wheat fields. He was pointing toward the barn, eyes wide, as if he'd seen something he shouldn't have. When we managed to get to him, all he could do was point into the darkness of the barn and mumble, "In there. There's something." My parents tried to calm him down, but I had a bad feeling. We all knew something was very wrong. Then I turned and looked at the barn. I felt a shiver down my spine. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. But there it was, right in the middle of the barn, a figure made of branches and wool. It was as if someone had gathered all the remains of the missing sheep, or perhaps a bad joke from a neighbor. My father stood frozen for a moment, as if trying to understand what was before him. My mother began to cry, whispering, "What do they want from us?" That artifact in the barn left us all in shock. We'd never seen anything like this before, and I started thinking about all the kinds of horror stories we'd heard in the region. Was someone trying to scare us? But how could it be someone from outside? There were no signs that the barn had been forced or broken into. And of course, the enclosure was intact, so how could a sheep just disappear without a trace? I couldn't stop looking at that figure. There was something so unsettling about the way the branches intertwined, like fingers, ready to reach out and grab anything that crossed their path. My father began asking questions out loud, as if he was trying to convince himself that everything had a logical explanation. Did the dogs attack? Was there a wild predator? But we all knew that wasn't it. Nothing made sense. My brother was crying softly now, leaning against the barn wall, like he was about to collapse. My mother was nervous, pacing from side to side, moving her hands and looking at that figure, not knowing what to do. We stood there, looking at that monster of branches, trying to understand what the hell was happening to our peaceful farm. After that day, everything seemed out of place. Waking up felt harder, like I was expecting something bad to happen at any moment. For weeks, I revisited that barn, looking for some logical explanation, but nothing made sense. My mother and father began to avoid the subject. Every time I brought up the subject of the missing sheep or the figure in the barn, they would change the subject or simply leave the room. My father tried to rebuild the enclosure, thinking that perhaps we had missed a hole or a crack. He did this 3 times, each time with the same failure. No more sheep disappeared, but there was no explanation for what happened. The nights were the worst. I would lie awake, listening to the barn boards creak, as if I was waiting for that branch thing to appear again. My brother was still traumatized. He couldn't be alone at night. He said he heard noises like low whispers coming from the barn. I didn't want to believe it could be true, but after a while, I started to realize that everything was connected. Each night, I felt a presence. It was as if the entire field was full of eyes watching, waiting for us to make a mistake, to make a false move. The figure in the barn never disappeared. She seemed to move when no one was looking, changing position or adjusting herself as if she were getting ready to attack us. My parents kept trying to ignore it, but I knew it couldn't be ignored. That artifact wasn't just some neighbor's cruel joke. There was something more there. Sometimes I would wake up at night and seem to see a shadow moving in the barn windows, as if it were peering inside. I couldn't stop looking at it, waiting for it to move again, for something else to happen. One night, while we were having dinner, my father received a call. He pulled away to answer it, and I could see the worried expression on his face. When he came back, he just said he was a friend from the surrounding area, who had been hearing strange things at night, murmurs, slow footsteps as if someone was walking among the fields. My father tried to laugh it off, as if it were just a problem of imagination, but I knew better. That artifact in the barn was becoming a more real presence with each passing day. Finally, after weeks of tension, my father made a decision that no one expected. He decided to sell the farm. I was devastated when my father announced that we were selling the farm. I was born and raised in that place, and I never imagined we would leave like this, afraid of something we couldn't understand. The branchy figure in the barn seemed to follow us, as if it knew we were running away. My mother cried every night, asking what we had done to deserve this. My parents kept the sale a secret until the last moment, just to avoid a big uproar in the community. But no matter what we did, that monster of branches never disappeared from our memory. He was always there, like a shadow over everything we did. The last night at the farm was the strangest of all. I couldn't sleep well. I spent the whole night awake, listening to every sigh, every creak coming from the barn. When dawn came, it was cold, colder than any December morning should be. Our neighbors came to help us carry the last of our things, but no one talked about the barn. It was as if everyone had woken up from a collective nightmare and were trying to forget what they had seen. When we finally closed the farm doors and drove out, I knew we had left something behind, not just a home, but a fear that will never completely disappear. We will never know what that figure really meant or why it appeared, but sometimes at night, when everything is very quiet, I can still hear the whispers, as if I am on the verge of discovering the answer. Story 3. I've never shared this with anyone other than my wife, but after 3 years I still can't forget what happened that night near Amarillo. I work as a farm equipment salesman and often travel through rural areas of Texas. It was a normal day at work. I had just visited a client and was heading home when my car started making a strange noise. It was after 8 p.m. and that road was too dark. You could barely see an inch in front of your nose. I tried to ignore the noise and continue my journey, but after about 15 minutes the car started to lose power and died altogether. I tried to start it several times, but to no avail. I took out my cell phone to call the tow truck, but of course, there was no signal. I sat in the car for about 20 minutes thinking about what to do, until I saw a faint light far away. It seemed to be coming from a house. I decided to walk there to ask for help. After all, I couldn't stay on the road all night. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and started walking. The air was heavy and stuffy, even though it was October. The closer I got to the house, the more I realized that something didn't feel right. It was an old farm, the kind you see in horror movies, with a large 2-story wooden house. The windows were closed with nailed boards, but you could see that faint light coming from inside, as if it were a candle or a lamp. What bothered me most was the silence. Do you know when the silence is so deep that your ears start to ring? It was exactly like that. No crickets, no night birds, no wind noise in the trees. Nothing. Just that suffocating silence and the mysterious light coming from inside the house. I stood in front of the house for a few minutes, trying to find the courage to knock on the door. The front door was huge, made entirely of dark wood, but it was a little rotten around the edges. Next to it was a porch that surrounded the entire house, with several old, dusty rocking chairs. I climbed the steps slowly, each step making the wood creak in a way that chilled my spine. When I got closer to the door, I noticed something strange. It was ajar, just a little, and I could see that faint light flickering inside. I called a few times asking if anyone was home, but no one answered. The wind began to pick up and the rocking chairs began to move on their own, making a noise that sounded like a child crying. My hands were shaking, but I needed help and that was my only option. I pushed the door slowly and entered. The smell of mold and rot was unbearable, mixed with something I couldn't identify at the time. The light I had seen came from some lit candles scattered around the room, but it didn't make sense to have candles burning in an abandoned house. The furniture was covered with white sheets full of dust, and on the walls there were several old paintings with portraits of a family. They were black and white photos, but there was something wrong with them. In all the photos, people's faces were blurred, as if someone had wiped them with a wet cloth. In the center of the room there was a huge dining table, and on top of it, my God, to this day I feel my stomach drop when I remember it. There were plates, cutlery, and glasses arranged, as if someone was about to serve dinner, but everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. The most disturbing thing is that there was food on the plates, all rotten and moldy, as if it had been left there for years. My instinct screamed at me to turn around and run, but something was pulling me into that house, as if it had a life of its own. I started to hear a noise coming from upstairs. It sounded like shuffling footsteps. At first I thought it could be an animal that had built a nest up there, but the steps were too heavy and rhythmic to be an animal. I pointed the flashlight at the stairs and saw strange marks on the steps. They looked like deep scratches in the wood, as if someone or something had been dragged up. The marks were fresh. The wood was still clear where it had been scratched. At that time my heart raced so much that I thought I was going to have a heart attack right there. But the worst thing wasn't the marks. It was the sound that began to accompany the steps. A kind of low singing, an old melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I climbed the stairs very slowly, trying not to make any noise. Each step creaked beneath my feet and I could feel the cold sweat running down my back. The hallway on the second floor was long and had several doors on both sides, all closed, except for one that was ajar at the end. The candlelight also reached up there, creating shadows that seemed to move on the walls. The footsteps and singing had stopped, but now I heard another sound coming from the room with the open door. It sounded like someone scratching a wall without stopping. As I got closer, I started to smell a strong smell of decomposition. It was the same smell I had smelled down there, only much more intense. My flashlight started to fail. The light flickered dimmer and dimmer, but I still managed to see something moving inside the room through the crack in the door. When I reached the bedroom door, my flashlight went out once and for all. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, trying to see something in the dim candlelight. The smell of rot was so strong that I began to feel anxious. It was then that I noticed something that made me freeze. There were handprints on the walls, hundreds of them, made with something dark and viscous that was still fresh. Some marks were from adult hands, others appeared to be from children. and as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed that the marks formed a pattern, as if people were trying to crawl away from something. The scratching sound had stopped, but now I heard heavy breathing coming from inside the room. It wasn't normal breathing. It sounded more like a wet wheeze, as if the lungs were filled with liquid. I slowly pushed the door open, and what I saw inside the room will haunt me for the rest of my life. There was an old bed against the wall, and on top of it there was a pile of papers spread out. I approached slowly and saw that they were newspaper clippings, all yellowed with age. The headlines talked about people missing in the region over the last 50 years. Dozens of cases, all with the same pattern. Travelers who had car problems on that road and were never seen again. But what made me almost faint with terror was seeing a recent photo pasted on the wall, taken that same day. It was a photo of my car parked on the road, and it had been taken from inside the house. Someone or something had been watching me from the moment my car broke down. My entire body was shaking and I could barely breathe. It was at that time that I heard the sound of something heavy dragging behind me. When I turned around, I saw something moving in the shadows of the room. It was bigger than a normal human being, and it moved in a completely wrong way, as if its bones were all broken. The candlelight reflected off the thing for a second, and I could see that its skin was gray and blistered, as if it were rotting. The worst thing was the eyes, huge, white and pupilless, fixed on me. There was something in his hands. It looked like an old camera, the same one he had probably used to take the photo of my car. The creature opened its mouth and made a sound I'll never forget. A mix of a scream and a gargle, as if its vocal cords were rotten. I didn't think twice. I ran out of the room as quickly as I could. I could hear that thing coming up behind me, crawling down the hallway at an impressive speed. The candles began to go out one by one, as if something was blowing them out, and darkness took over everything. The sound of wet breathing was getting closer and closer. I stumbled down the stairs, almost falling several times. The pictures on the wall started to shake and fall, and I could swear the people in the pictures were moving, their blurred faces looking like they were screaming. The smell of rot became so strong that I began to choke. I could feel the thing's putrid breath on the back of my neck, so close that its claws ripped the back of my shirt. I managed to get to the front door and ran out without looking back. The wind had become even stronger and the rocking chairs were moving violently. I ran as fast as I could down the dark road, tripping over the rocks, my heart wanting to come out of my mouth. That thing had stopped at the door of the house. I could feel its eyes following me, but for some reason it didn't leave the property lines. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally got to my car. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely put the key in the ignition. To my surprise, the car started right away, as if it had never had any problems. I stepped on the accelerator and didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. The next day, I returned with the police to the location, but the house was no longer there. There was only an empty plot of land covered in tall grass, as if nothing had existed there for decades. The police thought I was crazy or had dreamed it all, but I know what I saw. The only proof I have is my torn shirt and some photos on my cell phone that I took when I got home. The claw marks on my back, deep and infected, that took weeks to heal. To this day, I avoid going down that road, and whenever I need to travel for work, I make a point of returning before dark. I never managed to find out the true story of that house or what that creature was, but sometimes, when I'm sleeping, I still hear that strange singing and smell that decay. And on the darkest nights, I have the terrible feeling that that thing is still watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down so it can make me disappear like all the other victims.